In the late summer of 451, a river in Gaul did not dry up from the heat. It was simply displaced by the weight of two fading empires. The water was replaced by a pulsating crimson sludge as the riverbed filled with the discarded iron of the Roman legions and the shattered remnants of the Hunnic horde. On the Catalaunian Plains, the flat earth had completely vanished, replaced by a rising, vertical geography of the fallen that forced the living to climb a mountain of their own kin just to reach the opposing line. As the sun set, the military discipline of the ancient world dissolved into a primal, mechanical obliteration that had no name and no survivors of the spirit. The dawn would eventually reveal a landscape where the grass would never grow green again, fed by a soil that had been fundamentally altered by the scale of the loss. When a struggle reaches the point where the topography itself is built from those who were lost, is the survivor a victor or merely a ghost left to haunt a monument of his own making? The small rivulet winding through the Catalaunian Plains had forgotten the logic of gravity. In the late summer of the year 451, the water did not flow. It hesitated, then surged in a rhythmic throb that looked less like a current and more like a heartbeat. This was the first indication that the natural order of Gaul had been permanently severed. The stream had become a repository for things the earth was never meant to digest in such concentrated volume. Beneath the surface, the clear mountain runoff had been replaced by a stagnant crimson sludge, a thick slurry of silt, discarded iron, and congealing residue that had reached its saturation point. The banks were not overflowing because of a sudden deluge from the heavens, but because the riverbed itself had been paved with the remnants of two civilizations. Shields, broken spear shafts, and the heavy, unmoving weight of the fallen had created a dam of iron and bronze that forced the water to seek new, unnatural paths across the grass. This was not merely a battlefield, it was a terraforming event, a moment where the very geography of the world was being rewritten by the sheer, unceasing scale of the devastation. The topography was shifting in real time as the flat expanse of the plain began to sprout irregular, jagged mounds that had no basis in geology. These were the early foundations of a new landscape, one built from the remnants of empires and the shattered pride of kings. The air above this changing ground was thick and stagnant, recycled by thousands of lungs until it carried a taste of copper and wet wool that clung to the back of the throat like a physical residue. There was a profound, vibrating silence that preceded the total collapse of the military system, a heavy atmospheric pressure that made the ears ring with the sound of one's own blood. To any observer standing on the periphery, the sight would have been incomprehensible. The horizon had been erased by a rising shroud of dust, creating an artificial twilight that obscured the sun and turned the world into a monochrome of gray and red. The soldiers moving within this haze were no longer individuals with names or lineages. They had become the raw materials for a monument that was building itself. The ground beneath their sandals felt wrong, possessing a sponginess that suggested the earth had turned into a liquid, yet it held the terrifying resistance of a solid. They were stepping into a void where the laws of physics and the rules of engagement had been discarded in favor of a singular, crushing momentum. The world was not ending with a bang or a whimper, but with the rhythmic thudding of a river that had run out of room for its own water, signaling that the system of order had finally, irrevocably broken. The strategy of Flavius Aetius was not built on the shifting sands of hope, but on the cold, diamond-hard geometry of political and military necessity. By the late summer of the year 451, the man often called the last of the Romans had performed a feat of diplomatic alchemy that seemed, to any rational observer, like the ultimate safeguard of civilization. He had taken the fractured, warring tribes of Gaul, the Visigoths, the Alans, and the Franks, and fused them into a singular, rhythmic machine of war. To the officers standing on the gentle rises of the Catalaunian Plains, The Roman coalition did not look like a desperate gathering of rivals. It looked like a monolith of bronze and iron, a manifestation of order that had been perfected over 1,000 years. The logic was as simple as it was seductive. If the tribes could be taught to march in the Roman fashion, to hold the line with Roman grit, and to trust in the collective weight of the shield wall, then no force on earth, not even the scourge of God himself, could hope to penetrate their front. There was a profound, almost religious confidence in the physics of the formation, a belief that 80,000 men moving in lockstep created a kinetic energy that rendered individual fear irrelevant. Opposing this wall of civilized iron was Attila, a commander whose logic was rooted in the absolute certainty of divine appointment. The Hunnic horde was not a mob, but a fluid and highly responsive organism that functioned on the principle of absolute, unquestioning momentum. Attila believed that the Roman system was a brittle shell, a rigid structure that could be shattered if struck with enough psychological and physical force. His army was a composite of dread, a gathering of nations held together by the gravity of his own myth. To the Huns, the vast, flat expanse of the plains was not a battlefield, but a curated stage designed to maximize their mobility and the formidable reach of their composite bows. They moved with a relentless grace, their ranks vibrating with a subharmonic hum of anticipation that felt like the gathering of a storm. Both commanders looked upon the same stretch of geography and saw a perfect validation of their own doctrine. Aetius saw a flat surface where his heavy infantry could crush anything in its path through sheer inertia, while Attila saw an open corridor where his cavalry could exhaust the Roman machine. The atmosphere on that morning was one of clinical, formidable precision. The air was heavy with the scent of unwashed wool, oiled leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of sharpened bronze, a sensory profile of a world that had committed every resource to the act of collision. There were no sudden movements, no panicked shouts. There was only the steady, mechanical thud of thousands of boots striking the earth in a cadence that felt like the heartbeat of the world itself. The discipline of the Roman line was so absolute that it seemed to suppress the natural instincts of the men within it. Each soldier was a single gear in a vast grinding engine, his identity surrendered to the maintenance of the gap and the angle of the shield. This was the pinnacle of the ancient world's military logic, the belief that through training and structure, an army could transcend the limitations of the human spirit. The officers checked their alignments with the focus of architects, convinced that as long as the lines remained straight and the files remained deep, the outcome was a matter of simple mathematics. As the two armies closed the distance, the sun was gradually obscured by a rising shroud of fine, alkaline dust, creating a premature twilight that narrowed the world down to the space between the front ranks. The sound of the advance changed, shifting from the rhythmic pounding of feet to a singular, deafening roar that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of the plain. It was the sound of hundreds of thousands of voices merging into a wordless expression of intent, a vibration that felt less like human speech and more like the grinding of tectonic plates. Even as the first discharge of arrows began to arc through the gray air, the sense of control remained unshaken. The Romans raised their shields in a synchronized motion that looked like the closing of a great metallic wing, while the Huns adjusted their gallop with the fluid ease of a school of fish. Everything was proceeding according to the manuals and the cold calculations of the men who had spent decades preparing for this single afternoon. The system was functioning at its absolute peak, blinding them to the fact that they were marching into a trap of their own making, where their overwhelming numbers would soon become the instrument of their own paralysis. The initial collision between the Roman coalition and the Hunnic horde was a symphony of expected attrition, a deafening discharge of energy that seemed to validate every calculation made by the high command. For the first hour, the machine functioned with a formidable, rhythmic efficiency. The Roman center, anchored by the heavy infantry of the Alans, absorbed the first wave of the Hunnic charge like a massive, iron-reinforced spring. To the officers watching from the slight elevations of the Catalaunian Plains, the swaying of the lines was merely the natural respiration of a great engagement. They saw the clouds of arrows arcing through the dust and heard the familiar grinding roar of wood meeting bronze, interpreting these sounds as proof that the system was holding. There was a sense of profound professional satisfaction in the way the ranks shifted and the shield walls braced. It was the contest they had been trained to manage, a test of endurance and geometry where the superior discipline of the West would eventually wear down the erratic fury of the East. However, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, a subtle, unscripted friction began to manifest within the ranks. The forward momentum of the Roman advance did not stop, but it began to stutter, losing the fluid, hydraulic quality that was the hallmark of the tactical design. A centurion in the third rank might notice that his customary 3-foot stride had been reduced to a stumbling 6-inch shuffle. Yet he would dismiss this as the simple resistance of a stubborn opponent. The ground beneath his sandals, which had been a dry, alkaline crust only hours before, was beginning to feel strangely unstable, possessing a slick, yielding texture that defied the logic of the season. There had been no rain, yet the earth was turning into a dark, viscous slurry. The officers interpreted this as the expected result of thousands of trampling feet and the heat of exertion, failing to realize that the soil was being saturated by a heavy, dark moisture. They saw their men struggling for footing and ordered them to push harder, believing that the increasing difficulty was merely the final obstacle before a total collapse of the opposing line. This was the first fatal misinterpretation, the belief that the environment remained a neutral stage for their maneuvers. In reality, the geography was being actively terraformed by the density of the struggle. The remnants of the fallen were no longer individual figures to be stepped over. They were becoming a new, irregular topography that dictated the flow of the combat. In the center of the field, where the pressure was greatest, the accumulation of discarded iron and cooling remnants had reached a height that forced the combatants to strike upward rather than forward. To a commander looking through the haze of the artificial twilight, these rising mounds looked like tactical successes, literal walls of the fallen that proved the effectiveness of the Roman formation. They did not recognize that these mounds were actually becoming barriers that paralyzed their own maniples, turning a flexible structure into a series of isolated, stagnant pockets. The pride of the officers blinded them to the fact that their men were being funneled into a labyrinth of their own making. The communication system, the very nervous system of the army, began to exhibit signs of a creeping paralysis. Messengers sent to the wings disappeared into the brown fog of dust and iron-rich grit, their reports lost in a landscape that no longer possessed recognizable landmarks. A tribune might receive a report that the forces on the right flank were surging forward, but he could not verify it through the shroud of the midday gloom. The signals of the horns and the beat of the drums, intended to coordinate the movements of 80,000 men, were being swallowed by a singular, subharmonic vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was the sound of relentless structural friction, a wet, rhythmic thudding that drowned out the nuances of command. Rather than acknowledging this loss of control, the leadership doubled down on their existing orders, assuming that the silence from the flanks was the silence of a victory in progress. They mistook the absence of feedback for the achievement of their goals, continuing to drive the center into a space that was rapidly becoming a void. Inside the ranks, the physical sensation of the battle had shifted from a contest of skill to a grim form of manual labor. The air was no longer a gas to be breathed, but a thick, metallic suspension of dust and moisture that coated the inside of the lungs. Men found themselves exerting a level of force that should have been reserved for moving boulders, yet they were only trying to maintain their place in the line. The shields, once symbols of protection, were becoming heavy, saturated burdens that sapped the strength from the shoulders. When a man's muscles finally seized, he did not fall to the ground. He was held upright by the sheer density of the men around him, his paralyzed body becoming another component in the rising wall of the struggle. The officers saw this lack of falling and interpreted it as a sign of unbreakable morale, unaware that their soldiers were not standing out of courage, but because the geography of the loss had left them no room to collapse. The system was still functioning, but the soul of the army had already begun to sense that the world had changed. As the sun touched the horizon of the year 451, the Roman military machine reached the absolute limit of its mechanical logic. The system that had conquered the known world through discipline and geometry was now functioning at a terminal velocity where every movement served only to accelerate its own collapse. The soldiers in the center of the Catalaunian Plains were still following the drills ingrained in their training, still locking shields and stepping forward on command. But the commands were now echoes from a ghost hierarchy. The officers, blinded by the thickening veil of night and the alkaline dust of 80,000 trampling feet, continued to issue orders for rotation and reinforcement, unaware that the space required for such maneuvers had ceased to exist. The Roman maniple, designed to be a flexible and breathing organism, had been compressed into a solid, unyielding block of iron and mass that could no longer respond to the command of the army. The physical reality of the struggle had transitioned from a tactical engagement into a state of high-pressure stasis. Inside the ranks, the intimacy was no longer a source of strength, but a mechanism of constriction. Men were held upright by the sheer density of their comrades, their chests constrained against their own shields by the weight of the files behind them. The system was technically still holding. The line had not broken, but it was claiming the men within it through the simple physics of displacement. Every breath was a struggle against the collective mass, a desperate expansion of the lungs against the unmoving wall of bronze and leather. The sounds of the field had distilled into a singular, sub-harmonic vibration, a wet and rhythmic thudding of heavy impact that felt like the heartbeat of a fading giant. This sound did not come from any one direction. It rose from the earth itself, a groan of a landscape that was being terraformed by the weight of the lost. As the last light failed, the command structure of both the Roman coalition and the Hunnic horde dissolved into a profound and overwhelming confusion. The generals, who had begun the day as architects of history, were now reduced to wanderers in a labyrinth of their own making. Flavius Aetius, the man whose strategic brilliance was the final anchor of the Western world, found himself separated from his staff, stumbling through a landscape that no longer possessed recognizable landmarks. The geography of Gaul had been replaced by a new, vertical topography of the lost, where mounds of unmoving forms rose higher than the heads of the living. In the gloom, Aetius nearly walked directly into the camp of the Huns, unable to distinguish friend from foe, in a world where every soldier was coated in the same thick, drying layer of iron-rich mire. The distinction between the civilized Roman and the barbarian Hun had been erased by the shared texture of the struggle. The darkness brought no respite, only a deeper immersion into a localized and primal intensity that ignored the rules of engagement. Survival had ceased to be a matter of tactic or bravery and had become a matter of pure, blind chance. The armies were no longer tactical entities moving across a map. They had fused into a singular, churning organism of mutual exhaustion. This was the point of no return, the moment where the machine had overtaxed its own components to the point of structural failure. The discipline that had been meant to protect the soldiers was now the very thing that kept them trapped in the path of the conflict, preventing the retreat that might have saved them. The system was still functioning, the flags were still raised, and the ranks were still technically occupied, but the living were now merely providing the friction that kept the engine of the conflict grinding forward into the night. The night of the year 451 reached its formidable zenith, not with the silence of a concluded struggle, but with the heavy, suffocating realization that the world had been permanently altered by the lost. In the center of the Catalaunian Plains, the geography had completed its grim transformation. What had once been a flat expanse of Gallic soil was now dominated by a literal mountain of iron and remains, a somber peak of the fallen that rose so high it seemed to scrape the smoke-filled sky. From the summit of this artificial hill, the few survivors who still possessed the strength to stand looked down into a valley of flickering shadows, where the campfires of the Hunnic horde glittered like the predatory eyes of ancient spirits. The system of war had not merely failed, it had reached a state of terminal, ritualistic self-consumption. The Roman discipline that had survived 1,000 years was now a mechanism of paralysis, holding men in perfect, silent ranks atop the unmoving forms of their own kin. The air at the top of this monument was thick with a heavy atmosphere that transcended the simple smell of the engagement. It was a dense, wet heat generated by the collective stillness of 80,000 lives, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of the aftermath and the heavy scent of the rising pyres. This sensory wall was so dense that it felt like a physical weight, a reminder that the environment was no longer composed of nature, but of the discarded remnants of two empires. In the distance, within the perimeter of the Hunnic camp, a new and formidable logic was beginning to manifest. Attila, the man believed to be the literal whip of a vengeful fate, had sensed the evaporation of his own invincibility. In a final, desperate rejection of the world that had dared to resist him, he ordered a massive pyre to be constructed from the saddles of his cavalry, building a throne of fire. The psychological weight of this gesture rippled through the survivors on the mountain of the fallen, acting as a profound and irreversible point of no return. It was a signal that the rules of civilization and the laws of order had been incinerated. The soldiers standing on the ramparts of the fallen realized that they were no longer fighting for a victory or a cause. They were merely the fuel for a catastrophe that had moved beyond human control. The Roman legionaries, still holding their marked shields in accordance with the ancient statutes of the Republic, found themselves guarding a landscape of loss that they had built with their own hands. Their adherence to the formation was no longer an act of tactical necessity, but a symptom of a psychological weight so deep that it had replaced their instinct for self-preservation. They stood their ground because the ground was all they had left, even if that ground was composed of the memory of those they had sworn to protect. As the fires of the saddle pyre grew, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains, the distinction between victor and vanquished was finally and irrevocably erased. The shared destination of the end had become the only reality that mattered. The Roman coalition and the Hunnic horde had fused into a singular, churning organism of devastation that was now in the process of ritual self-erasure. There was no longer any strategy to discuss, no orders to give, and no glory to be harvested. There was only the mechanical sound of the strike and the silence of the void filling the space where an army used to be. The system of the legion and the system of the horde had achieved their final, perfect form. A solid block of humanity so disciplined and so broken that it allowed itself to be removed from history, one man at a time, without breaking rank. The world was not just being destroyed, it was being replaced by a monument of its own making, a testament to the fact that when the geometry of fear is drawn correctly, there is no escape, only the passive wait for the end. When the dawn finally arrived on the morning after the year 451, it did not bring the clarity of a new day, but a monochrome revelation of a world that had ceased to exist. The light was a cold, indifferent gray that stripped the landscape of its remaining dignity, revealing a topography that was unrecognizable to any living eye. The silence that gripped the Catalaunian Plains was not the peaceful quiet of a conflict concluded, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a void. It was the sound of a vacuum where a civilization had once breathed, a silence so profound that it seemed to press against the eardrums with more force than the roar of the engagement itself. The mountain of the fallen, which had reached its zenith in the darkness, now stood as the only landmark in a sea of gray and crimson, a jagged monument of iron and remains that had permanently altered the horizon of Gaul. The few survivors who remained standing did not cheer, nor did they offer prayers of thanks to the gods who had abandoned them. They moved with the tentative, disjointed motions of sleepwalkers, their eyes fixed on a reality that their minds could no longer process. When they looked at their hands, they did not see the skin of men. They saw a thick, drying crust of iron-rich mire that made it impossible to tell where their own forms ended and the remnants of their kin began. The distinction between the Roman, the Visigoth, and the Hun had been erased by the shared texture of the struggle. They were no longer representatives of empires or tribes. They were the ghosts of a world that had collapsed upon itself, left to wander a landscape of loss of their own making. The pride, the discipline, and the fury that had driven them into the collision were now just discarded abstractions, as irrelevant as the broken spear shafts buried beneath the mounds. The realization of what had been done arrived with a sickening, internal jolt. The mound of the fallen was not a byproduct of the war, but its final and permanent achievement. The land had been so thoroughly saturated with the scale of the loss that the natural cycle of the earth had been corrupted. The survivors understood, with a clarity that only those at the end possess, that the grass upon these plains would never grow green again. It would emerge from the soil as a sickly, dark purple, fed by the congealing residue that had replaced the groundwater. The geography of the world had been rewritten in iron and leather, creating a landscape that no longer recognized the passage of the seasons, only the relentless accumulation of the fallen. The system of order had not been defended. It had been used as the instrument of a total mathematical erasure. As the cold wind of the morning began to stir the alkaline dust, it carried the scent of a world that had run out of time. There were no messengers riding to Rome or to the steppes of the East to report a victory, for there was no one left who could claim the title of victor. The hundreds of thousands of men who had marched out with the rhythmic thud of confident predators were now just the texture of a new, somber geology. The Roman Republic and the Hunnic horde had both found their end in the center of the press, leaving behind a vacuum that would never be filled. The survivors were merely the custodians of a ruin, left to haunt a monument built from the very people they had sworn to protect. The engagement was over, the trap was empty, and the only truth that remained was the finality of a civilization that had chosen the darkness of the earth over the light, leaving nothing behind but a field where the geography of fear had been drawn correctly.